welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I am an Episcopal priest living here in Austin, Texas, and in long-term recovery from alcoholism and any number of other things. The purpose of these podcasts is to dive a little bit deeper into the history of AA, into the psychology of it, and the spirituality. It's kind of designed, I think, for those who either want to go a little deeper into the program, those who may be coming back and saying, I want to do it differently this time, or those who've been at it for a long while and saying, is this all there is? That's kind of what happened to me. At 20 years sober, I discovered the history, and it opened up a whole new world of the program to me. So that is our hope, and I invite you to visit our website. It's titled Two-Way Prayer. While you're there, please do us a favor and sign up for the newsletter. And again, I thank all of our supporters who are making contributions, large and small, to kind of keep this thing afloat. And I really do appreciate that. Doing a series, actually, this is going to be the end of the series, I think. I never quite know, but that's my plan anyway. That we've been doing a series on, people in 12-step always sound spiritual, but not religious, And so this is trying to dive a little bit deeper into that. And we've had some historians on and some other folks to kind of look at it from some different angles. And for the final podcast, I thought it would be great to visit with my old friend Matt D. from All Addicts Anonymous, because he knows the history of many of these things better than I, and has a very unique take on it. Matt is the director of a program called All Addicts Anonymous. It was started by Tom Powers, and we'll visit a little bit about that. And what they do is they try to hang on to the original program, which is the 12 steps and the 4 absolutes, and a real laser-like focus on the 5th chapter, I think, of the big book. What exactly did we do here? And then they ask themselves, are we really doing it? Or are we just talking about it? So, Matt, welcome once again. We did a whole series with Matt, and I will put a link to that in the show notes because I think you'll find him really interesting. And the series that we did several months ago, I think you'll find really interesting as well. So I'm going to shut up for a second, Matt, and welcome. Good to have you.
Yeah, glad to be back. Thank you.
All right. So tell us a little bit about this guy, Tom Powers. Who was he, and what did he do, and how did you get wrapped up in this thing?
So Tom Powers was early AA member. He was but prior to his coming into AA, he was a successful advertising executive. Very wordy, very intelligent. His drinking had caught up with him. It was primarily, he understood that it was primarily a crutch, if you will, a life crutch for him, alcoholism, for abandoning, which is on the subject. He abandoned religion as a young man and felt very empowered when he made that step. Essentially, there are many people who have been in the situation where you just essentially invite God out of your life.
Almost seems to be part of the process, doesn't it? You got to go through that phase, that stage.
It really seems like you do very often. Maybe there's some people who are just not brought up with the subject of God around them very much, so the inviting isn't as drastic. I'm not sure. I don't know. But for him, it seemed like it was fairly drastic, and he really took on the idea that God essentially is a superstition that people made up just to help them deal with their fears. That in a way, empowers a person and empowered him for a long time. What happens is you have to rely deeply on your own capabilities and abilities. And it's very hard to keep that one going.
Yeah.
The ego is only, it's a frail and a weak thing in its own way. When you turn your will and life over to God, you're not turning over a Rolls Royce or something. You're really turning over something that is fairly weak and not very reliable. Anyway, but you got to have some kind of glue to keep it all together. And if all of your eggs are in the ego basket, which I don't see how they could be otherwise, until you really come to a first step. If you need some kind of glue to help you keep it all together, you need something to help you get through.
Historically, Matt, I mean, I'm talking big picture. That is the function of all of the different religions. It's glue to hold the community together, to have a shared common story that people can relate to, and if that glue is in place, by and large, people do pretty well because they don't question a whole bunch of things. But it's been falling apart actually for a few hundred years now. It's been falling apart, and that was one of the things I mentioned in a previous episode, that like every 500 years it kind of goes through a rearrangement, and we're at the tail end of that right now.
Well, I think where there's a synonymous thing between the experience that happens to a person in the program and the experience that happens to someone in religion, and I mean this by not nominal like religion. I don't mean just superficial religion or plastic Jesus, as they say. It starts off with, and this is synonymous in all religions, it starts off with the same exact thing. It crushes your trust in yourself. I mean, the first noble truth, dukkha, is this thing of suffering. It's like, that's the first thing, or the beatitude. It's the first one is spiritual poverty. It means to be poor in your own egotism. It's like, that's how you start out. That's the first step, really, is in the first three steps is setting you up for turning your will and life over to God. You don't get through that door until you get through the kind of suffering that makes it so that you don't trust yourself in the same way. That's very different than just a devotional thing where you show up, or just a bunch of morality, which, as good as that is in itself, real religion in this sense, synonymous with all religions, is you start out with that experience. And that's what Bill's experience was, and Tom's experience, and so many that come in, everybody that comes in the program. If it's going to stick, you got to have some kind of an experience where you do not trust yourself. You do not trust the personality in the same way as you did.
That's right. It has to come apart before it can come back together in a different shape.
It's almost like it's baptizing. You have confidence in yourself wrongfully, unwarranted, unmerited confidence in yourself, because you're getting let down all the time. Now you got to deal with it with whatever your substance or addiction is. It helps you power through, if you will, towards death and insanity. But where was I going on my thread there? I lost my track.
The nature of the ego and how that relates to religion is if that holds up for people. I mean, this is my point that I've been studying, that it provides something for them. It keeps them in many ways from even having to ask the question. But when that falls apart, and now when we are falling apart as alcoholics and addicts, and we're looking to religion, it's like, I can't go there. For many, it's lost its power. It's lost its power to provide the glue in many cases.
Yeah.
And that certainly was the case for Tom, and it was the case for Bill. And so tell us a little bit about Wilson. Where was he at with this stuff? Because he Some people say he was an atheist, some an agnostic. What was he?
I think I think he was a people's person in the sense that he could adapt very well with those that were around him. But I think when you talk about Wilson, just me, this is the way I see him. I think I see him at in different a different frame of mind or different relationship to these things at different times.
Hmm.
I think he was extremely influenced, and this is kind of a newer, I wouldn't say a newer thing, but has been gaining strength with me just mentally on the subject. I think he was influenced highly by Dr. Bob, who was influenced by obviously the Oxford group, which they both had been involved in. But I think like Dr. Bob held on to those principles, the four absolutes. My God, the very first AA meeting that they had, where they actually broke from the Oxford group and started to hold their meetings. Actually, the first one was in Dr. Bob's house. The whole entire meeting was Dr. Bob reading the Sermon on the Mount. That's what they did. There were like 90 people stuffed into his house, and if you've ever been in his home, it's very small. And that was before they found the neutral place of the King School Group. I
Hmm.
think that Bill's pivotal time, it was very so Bill's spiritual experience, and consequently prior to that, his having his confidence in his ego, personality, and all of that. He essentially, when he started to associate with Dr. Bob, I kind of feel like he was almost somewhat of a clean slate. I feel like the time that they spent together, not only did it help formulate this program, which is changing millions of people's lives, but I think it left a deep impression on him that lasted all the way through. There wasn't. Go ahead. You're going to say
Well, I was
something?
going to say he spent, if I remember correctly, about 3 months living with Bob and Ann in Akron. And is that what you're talking about? Maybe it was the
Yes.
beginning of the heavy influence that they had.
Yeah. I really think it was during that period of time. Probably, there was 3 or 4 months that he was living there. There was, there was a lot of. It sounds like there's a lot of back and forth, and even Lois came and stuff. It sounded
Hmm.
like that was a very impressionable time on Bill, and it's kind of like Dr. Bob had all the pieces together except one, and Bill had that one primary thing that Dr. Bob was missing, and vice versa. It was kind of a puzzle piece. The two of them fit together so well. They both were missing something, and they both provided it for one another. And I think that they influenced one another in a major way.
Right. It wouldn't be the program if either one hadn't made their contribution.
But you really do need the two types. I mean, you
The
got the one
two.
is the one is
Yeah.
even from the standpoint of the one being of having a slip or wanting to take a drink for their whole sobriety, where the other is,
Which was
yep,
Bob, huh? That was
yep,
Bob's
yep.
deal.
Without this profound spiritual experience like Bill had, and then Bill had this profound experience, and pretty much his place of temptation was in other areas.
Hmm.
It's an interesting, the prototype of the two different types. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Now, when Tom came along, let's first discuss when they were putting the book and the program together. There was some very heavy debate going on what is the place of religion within the
Yeah,
framework of what we're building here. How do
yeah,
we navigate this?
yeah. I think there was a real that was a thing that really it was pivotal for the movement because you were using that common quote in the beginning that people often say, that you hear him say all the time, and not only in 12-step circles anymore, but you hear it's being said outside of that, which is, I'm spiritual and not religious. And I remember Tom Jr.'s, so Tom Powers Sr., his son Jr., who also got into AA. He's the author of the Gresham's Law. He used to say that the definition of the word religion the Latin word religiare, your ligaments are what is, it's what holds your bones and your muscles together. It's a power that is binding. It's a binding power, right? And that's what, in its true sense, religion is. In that true sense, that's what happens to you in AA or any other 12-step fellowship. You literally become bound and grafted in to a God-centered way of life. It's not a sect. A sect, interestingly enough, is a section, means to be cut off from. And that doesn't mean you're cut off from God, but you are in a certain sect or group, if you will. And so when the thing went from being a Christian fellowship, which when they were affiliated with the Oxford group, and all the debates started to occur between, there were primarily three factions: those who wanted AA to be a Christian fellowship or of some kind of Christian affiliation. There were those who wanted it to be God still, but no particular affiliation with any, with Christianity or any other kind of religion. And there were those who wanted a, totally psychological book that didn't, if we can't agree on God amongst ourselves, let's take it out altogether. Mm-hmm. And so you had this mixture, this faction of different people. And I think a lot of your more conservative type Christian views are coming from Chicago. And then also there were the Fitzmayo. There were different, persons. That each group had a extreme charge behind their view, and everything was colliding together. And you remember, these are early alcoholics just trying to, with early sobriety, trying to hang on.
And the big book, Matt, is an interesting amalgamation of all of those three, isn't it?
It really is.
It's like I read it at one point and I'm getting this, then I read it from another perspective a few lines later and I'm getting something else.
It really is. And I feel like this was Wilson's kind of genius. I mean, first of all, you read it and you see it in the way that any harmony can be made out of these opposing, exploding topics and views. Right. Wilson's genius is his ability to be able to navigate and to, I don't want to use the word appease, but it's the first one that comes to me, to be able to appease these different factions and yet keep the thing strong enough. I mean, one of the reasons that he and Dr. Bob, they wanted to do a book to begin with is they didn't want the message that they had to be watered down. They wanted it to be solidified in a place that it wouldn't be. It's just human nature that you interpret these things in lesser degrees in time or in distance from spiritual experience, and then you end up with kind of nothing, or something very far from its original purpose. They're like, we have to get this nailed down in print. And Bill was able to navigate around it. I guess he was able to convince everyone. He took kind of a middle road, the middle path, if you will. And mm-hmm. we're gonna keep God in it, but we're gonna use it as God as you understand him. They removed some of the phrases that were, more denominational or more Christian, and being on your knees. Right. But they were able to navigate through that, and it was a thing that really worked well for everyone. Did they lose some of that original vigor and stuff? Maybe so, but one of the major things that I believe that was done was you took this fellowship out of the realm of a sect or an association with Christianity. You didn't dishonor that relationship, mm-hmm. because when it says God as you understand him, you can have any understanding of God that you want. You can, it isn't exclusive in that sense. It's inclusive. It allows anyone with wherever they are. And I think that's what saved the fellowship, because otherwise, right. how many small Christian fellowships have just gone by the wayside over the years. This is something very different than that.
And balancing this is, that's what they attempt to do. I mean, my take on all of this is that programs and churches come along and they try to take the AA stuff and incorporated it into one thing, and and they lose it. They
Yeah.
lose it. It's
Yeah,
a
I agree.
balance. It's a balance between the two. And I go to this entity for certain things, and I go to that entity for certain things. But I don't try to mesh it into one thing, because it is a balance. And about Tom, as he evolved spiritually, he also evolved along certain religious lines, did he not?
Well, I think Tom had this real added benefit of coming to this thing as an atheist. And at a certain point, after you have these, crashing life crises, and you have to get your life right or you're going to die, you become open to, again, it starts off with a lack of faith or trust in your own abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And then what becomes the most critical point of your life has to be, what is true? Like, what is the truth? And I don't mean that necessarily fully in a philosophical manner, at first, but I mean basic raw, like, did I just lie to my boss? Am I lying to my wife? You start out with the truth in a very basic way,
Right.
and then it starts to broaden out, and you're like, you start to question, like, that's the thing that the ego doesn't do very often. It doesn't really question, it already knows. And when you have this experience, you start to question things. And these guys, I guess that would technically make you what you'd call a seeker. They really started to look for, what is the truth. And if the Buddha said something that was truthful, you didn't discount it because he wasn't a Christian. If you were a Christian, this was a truthful statement. You start
Right.
to look at what's true. And they were Tom and I believe, Bill, and also Dr. Bob. They became very fascinated with the idea of seeking what was true. I think they also were very they took the original phrase in step 12 is having had a spiritual experience. They took spiritual experience to be pivotal as well. Like, it was critical that a person would work towards, I hate to get into it, but it's like, it has to do with states of consciousness.
That's right.
Like,
No, that's fine. It is.
and
It's
every
exactly what it is. Yeah.
and every alcoholic knows about a change of your state of consciousness. You take a couple of drinks, or you do a
Right.
certain drug, or a certain behavior that elicits some kind of a change.
Yeah.
And we're actually, in a lot of ways, are very proficient in it. You study it, you start to prep, you try to figure out how to do it right. How do you do it and not throw up or get arrested
right.
or whatever. And you become, basically, your whole life is centered on trying to have spiritual experience. You will literally give your life for it. I mean, you will spend all the money that you have. You
Yeah.
will throw away family relationships. You will do almost anything. You will almost kill for this thing. Maybe some people may even get to that condition where they will. So spiritual experience to an addict is critical. And you want to learn how to deal with it in a means in which you don't feel bad about it the next morning, a way that is legitimate. There's this quote in the Christian scriptures about getting into the pasture by jumping over the wall instead of going through the gate. And an addict is experiencing spiritual experience in full egotism and climbing over the gate. They're trespassing when they have this kind of experience. They're not going through the legitimate door. And their whole thing was to figure out where's the door and how to get into it. They made some they got into some very interesting things, and they found out later wasn't a door for them. Like they were doing spook sessions and Ouija boards and contacting the dead, and they were also doing things like taking LSD. They were making different attempts, and it was not done in a hippie or careless or irresponsible fashion. They were
Right.
deeply concerned with legitimate spiritual experience.
And that is the bailiwick of religions historically. is to help lead people to that kind of an experience. The problem is, if it gets encrusted with all sorts of crap, cut to the chase here, it kind of keeps people from that experience.
Well, I think the reason that
Or
Wilson
it
was
can,
so,
it can, it
Yeah.
can.
yeah, yeah. And I think the reason that Wilson was so fascinated, one of the reasons Wilson was so fascinated with William James, is that
Mhm.
James saw that the initiation of the spiritual experience was utter deflation, like that was the beginning of the spiritual experience. It wasn't a separate thing.
The
And I think
collapse of the ego, the collapse of the ego.
exactly,
Yeah.
and this is a vacuum thing where you've got to
Mhm.
make room for something. And
Right.
if that doesn't happen, and you're seeking the spiritual experience, I mean, that makes that very well is an egotism version of jumping over the fence sometimes. It's like
Exactly.
you got to go through the door of ego deflation in order to have this kind of experience. And nobody can deflate their own ego by themselves. So it's an interesting thing. So that's
Well,
why life circumstances are very important. If somebody,
right.
you going through something that's just totally flattening you.
Yeah, and what
um
Jung said is, success after midlife has nothing to teach a person.
yes, yes,
It's ego deflating things that open us up
yes.
to that reality that we're avoiding.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I
Now, go ahead.
yeah, no, go.
Well, Tom saw value in religions. He described himself as a Christian, but a mongrel. That he followed the Christian tradition, but he also explored other things that, like you were describing, there are a number of different doors. There isn't just one door, you know, but there's value in these different doors, because they're historically based, and it's like I don't have to start off. My God, I was so lost when I first got sober. I remember I'm living in a halfway house. My life had just gone to hell, and I was questioning my own faith tradition and all that sort of stuff. And I swear to God, this is true, Matt. There was a guy there who called his higher power George, and I didn't know who the hell George was, and I didn't, But it's like I prayed George, and it's like. There was no depth to George. Whereas
No.
if you look at some of these other traditions, dangerous as they are, and can be, particularly if you try to say, well, this is the only one, this is the right, true, absolute, that can be a killer. But Tom approached it that there's some wisdom here, and we need to look at it that way and benefit from it. And like you were saying, take the truth that you find there and put it to use.
Well, I don't know about anyone else, but I think like without having some kind of experience where, the egotism gets squeezed or,
Hmm.
impaired somewhat, I look at these things as just a bunch of rules, blue nose stuff that it's like, why would I want to do any of it? All of a sudden, you have this major life crisis of some kind. You get a divorce, or a child is sick and almost on the verge of death, or who knows what it is, or rack up a car or end up in jail or whatever it is, and then all of a sudden you can look at these things in a very different way.
Right.
You have all of your preconceived notions get kind of wiped away. For again, that's why it's critical. Time is very critical in this regard, because that's has an expiration date. Of course, the ego always revives and returns.
Hmm.
Hopefully it's handicapped slightly, but and that's where the rules actually come in. And nobody likes the words rules. Of course, we have the word steps or absolutes, but they come in because they're the thing that helps keep this thing in check, and all of the religions have them.
Right.
And
You
I
might call
think
them practices. You might call them
you can
practices.
call them, sure, you can call them practices. And I think
Yeah.
that if you have not had that kind of critical life experience, you kind of look at it and you're like, all right, how can I skip past all the rules and actually get to the experience part? You know, how can I have the fun out of it without, you know, and this is a package that all goes together, of course.
Yeah. I want the body of the weightlifter, but I don't want to go to the gym.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so we try to skip. So let's try to nail down, and the list could be pretty lengthy. I try to identify several, but let me just kind of go through them. So what I'm trying to look at here is this: are there practices that the various faith traditions have pursued and found to be valuable? And we in 12 step are kind of outside of that, looking in, and perhaps without it, bereft of it. See, one of the things Wilson said, which I thought was very insightful, is one of the most dangerous things is that if AA becomes a religion.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't nailed down where he said that. If you can find it, let me know. But he's right. He's right.
Yeah.
You know, that with the world doesn't need one more religion, and alcoholics certainly don't need one religion, and don't, for God's sakes, don't turn AA into.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
see if there is some value, and look and see where religious people are right, and that's what it says in the thing. So that's what I want to do. So I want to name some of these, and we'll tell us where Tom went with some of these and where you've gone with them. And so we're going to look at practices, religious practices. And the first one I'd start with is meditation. Meditation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I think that you know, to say for Tom, but also of course Bill and also Bob, that there was this generalized thing where it was all of them were practicing what they called the quiet time. You know, all of them were doing a time of quiet. I heard a friend describe it recently of saying that you want to get up in the morning and do your you want to do your prayers before your ego wakes up. You know, it's like that was one thing that they all shared, and I think a majority of the early AA members shared.
And they saw it as more important than meetings.
They did.
Practice.
They did. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, they did. And that was critical. Now, how each of them practiced in their own way, and what they did, I'm not sure. I think one thing that those three persons had in common is I think Scripture was part of that time. The spiritual study was part of that time. Mm-hmm. Apparently, Dr. Bob, you know, read something like an hour a day, and and he read the Bible like over and over and over again. You know, it was a major part of his thing. And Bill Wilson did the same. He actually read the Bible. I think the difference between the two seems like Dr. Bob had very key things that he read and meditated on. Bill would do more of a just open the Bible at random and see what speaks to you. Go ahead.
Which is an important, if I could just interrupt for a moment here, because this was very helpful to me. Meditation, and you say Bob would meditate, he would read and meditate. And in the Western Christian tradition, that is a legitimate form of meditation, to think deeply on the things that you just read. You know, I thought you had to go to zero nothingness. It was like Zen, you know, and I think there's been a lot of that that's come into 12-step, that Christian meditation is out, Buddhist meditation is in, and that's fine. I think there's great value in both, but it isn't one or the other.
Well, you see, when you by the time that Tom and Bill are working on the 12 and 12, there is a reference to meditation in there,
Mhm.
and they refer to it in the exact way that you're saying, and it is the Bernard of Clairvaux technique of you read something very slowly, meditatively, and then
Right.
you ask, what does this thing mean, and
Right.
then you flip it over into prayer and ask God to help you do it.
It's
And it's a
Lectio Divina. It's a sacred
yes.
reading.
Yes, and
Yeah.
I think that they all of the pioneers did that. I mean, definitely Bill, Bob,
Hmm.
and Tom for sure. So there was some study involved, and for Tom, it seemed there was definitely. I mean, he did a lot of different things. Everything from, he was into yoga back in the 1950s.
Right.
He and Bill were, so Bob dies in 1950, and so Tom was very involved with Bill after Dr. Bob's death, and they spent a lot of time with a number of people. I mean, Bill was a what do you want to say? He was somebody who related to people who were authors, people who communicated. People, he was. I think that was another part of Bill's genius, is the ability to communicate. The transmission of knowledge through oral means was key to Bill Wilson. And I mean, the whole fellowship is born around this idea that you tell your story, you talk to other people about. Now, we got some of that from the Oxford group. They called them shares or witnesses or whatever, but that was key for Bill. And he related to people in an oral way, and he talked to people a lot. And they were in all kinds of circles of, writers at the time. Everybody, the Vincent Peale and the Orslers, and I think one of the persons that was very influential to Bill and Tom was Gerald Hurd, who had
Hmm.
come from. He was a contemporary and close friend with Aldous Huxley. They both came over from England together. They both lived out in California, and Hurd was something of a spiritual sponsor for both Bill and Tom, and Hurd was into everything. He was part of the Vedanta movement, but he was, he studied, you know, Saint Francis de Sales and the Way of a Pilgrim, but also Sri Ramakrishna, and I think that Hurd was a key person as a spiritual sponsor for these guys, introducing them. I think Tom was already, such of a seeker, and Bill, but Tom was, already had gotten involved in studying so many different people. But Gerald Hurd was really did direct and help them both.
So the spiritual paths, the religious paths, let me correct myself, be it Buddhism, the Hindu faith, the Muslim faith, the Christian faith, they have people who have gone into each of those wells, let's call them, quite deeply. And those people then can become your teachers. And I think this is one of the things that if AA, if people in 12 step try to make 12 step a religion, all we are going to do is go over and over and over again the same thing without reaching out and going deep in a particular tradition and finding, like you're listing here, thinkers, people who are on the edge and kind of
Yeah,
advancing the knowledge and the wisdom for us. I'm always excited when I find a new teacher, you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
Um,
I think it was Meister Eckhart. I could be wrong, but it was something of the phrase was "God save me from God," and it's the idea that you can form your own interpretation. That's why the thing of states of consciousness are very important, because you interpret things at whatever your state of being is at. And very often you interpret these things. I think this is why many people, in my understanding, wrongly believe that Buddhism is a form of atheism, where the word God
yeah,
isn't used. And I think it's because the word God is so unbelievably,
yeah,
um, it, it's your own interpretation of something. And if you were, and this is the interesting thing that I think is important to take in mind. We're talking about God, we're talking about religion, we're talking about these things. If, and this is why, again, states of consciousness are so important. If we were all to experience Bill Wilson's, white light experience,
Mhm.
it's like there are no words for this thing, and it isn't your imaginings or your ideas or your logic chopping ideas of what God are. It's like actual experience. I was saying this
Yeah.
before. The word to know is really to unite. In the biblical sense, that when someone knows their wife, they bear and conceive a child. It is to literally unite, and to
Right.
have an experience like that is to know. It isn't belief. It is direct knowledge. It is conscious contact, and that
Right.
cuts through all of the sectarian doctrinal things. Like, it just cuts right through. It would be hard to have a discussion, maybe even hard to even listen to the one we're having now
Yeah.
after having such an experience.
Right. Right. And Wilson, I love this when I came across the tape of him saying how he changed it to an awakening, a more tepid form of experience, he calls it. And then he tried to change it back to experience. And the quote religionists, let's say, the mechanical people in the program said, well, you can't do that,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I hadn't seen that reference until you shared it with me. I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, it's
Um,
hilarious. It's
yeah,
hilarious because
yeah,
it just nails. I mean, you can look at religion, and I think it was Jung who said it, as designed to keep you from God.
yes, yeah,
We're going to create
yeah,
a whole bunch of things, and we want you to
yeah,
stay busy with these things so that you don't have to deal with what's up here. We will take care of that.
yeah, yeah,
Well, God is out of the box is the expression that I hear in some of the literature. That God's out of the box. It was really
yeah,
nice when he was in the box. That's a nice medieval concept, you know. But he's loose. The spirit is loose. Now,
yeah,
where do we go
yeah.
with that? Is the question.
I feel like it's very critical the way that a person approaches these things, because I think you can get into religion, quote unquote, and not actually go through the door, and
That's right.
therefore it becomes and I think that's why they were constantly trying to figure out what was the door and how do they get through it.
Mhm.
um, because you can't bring your egotism through that door. You don't fit through the eye of the needle.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I want to talk just a little bit about Eastridge because Tom Tom was he was very intense, and he was very intent also on trying to create a lived experience of the program. And I suspect that is what Eastridge was, an attempt to have people live together and work the program very intensely. And could you talk to us a little bit about that? I had the honor of visiting it there twice, and I was blown away by what I saw being attempted. So talk to us about that in the context of religious people pieces
Sure,
too, if you would.
sure. Yeah, I think so. We kind of been jumping around a lot. I think it would help people
That's
if
all
they
right.
were listening to us, that they listen to all our other discussions, because I feel like this is kind of a continuation of many of them.
Yeah.
And it would help fill in some of the cracks. But I think much of, like, even the All Addicts Anonymous concept that Tom had come up with is coming out of his own experience. This is a guy who got into AA when the Four Absolutes were still part of the picture. And he incorporated the experience that he had, just kind of like Bill did as well, and Dr. Bob did. I mean, Dr. Bob was the most faithful of them all. These guys, one of the great things about these guys is they did not betray their previous teachers in any regard. They really did give credit. I mean, they didn't have to talk about, the Oxford group at all, and they ended up really giving them credit quite a bit. Now, they dropped the Four Absolutes, formally, and Bob never did, but they still gave credit. And I think Tom always gave credit to the previous, where he had his experience, and the Four Absolutes were part of that from the very beginning. Anyway, he had, coming into this thing, into his own recovery, he had gone from being an atheist, finally had, and I've talked about it before on here, he had a spiritual experience in which he was going through, he actually had a couple of spiritual experiences, but the last one where he got over the going from, an unsober person to a sober person, was he was in a hospital receiving shock treatment, and he heard someone yelling, "God help me, God." He later, in coming back to himself, who could have been yelling? Who could have been yelling for God? I mean, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in this. And then at that point, he realized that God lives in all men, but some men have to be squeezed a little harder than others to get to him. So he went from the transition of being an atheist to a theist, and that transition also made him go from being a non-sober member of AA to a sober member of AA. And he again became fascinated with what was true, and he also took the subject of theism very seriously. Mm-hmm. So he was studying Buddhism and Hinduism, and he wanted to hear authentic men's experience of God. And of course, this echoes Bill Wilson's experience as well, reading something like Varieties of Religious Experience. These kinds of experiences were important to these men. And he went from that, and eventually he found his home. At first, he would have had a hard time reading things about Christianity. He just had so much baggage that was there. But eventually, as his life in the program, he started to mature and deal with his resentments and other things. He started to become open to Christianity.
And he also found teachers who could make sense of some of that stuff that he questioned so deeply, eh?
And absolutely. And I mean, you often hear, and you get an impression of Bill Wilson of being somebody that was probably something of maybe a spiritualized agnostic or something. And it's like, actually, it was Bill Wilson who was the one that told him to read the Bible every day. Mm-hmm. It was Bill Wilson was the one that taught him to say the 23rd Psalm every day. Mm-hmm. Like, there were certain Christian things that were of importance, and that was a kind of experience Tom was getting from these different persons. He also knew Dr. Bob and other people in the program. He was getting a lot of help from these teachers. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, he made the divide from being, went from an atheist to a theist, and then had become a Christian. But again, as he says in Invitation to a Great Experiment, the book that he later had written, that he really came to this thing as a mongrel, and somebody who was open to the truth wherever he could find it, and that it didn't exclude, that didn't make him, non-Christian. Oddly, there's, I don't mean to say oddly, but there's a statement that Christ makes in the scriptures that says, those who aren't against us are for us. I think he saw anybody that was for the truth and was for God was for what he was for. And that put him into some serious searching. And at a certain point, he you need to do this thing in a group. You really do. And that's the one thing that the religions have always done, and even Christ did himself. The early, Buddhists did. I mean, everywhere you go, you've got to do this thing together. There are rare exceptions, probably those times are past, in the desert at one point. But he, formed a group, and there's a lot of steps that happened prior to that, but in upstate New York. And a lot of people started to come in for help. He had a piece of land. His son came and also got a recovery. And oddly or interestingly, I mean to say that all of these people that were damaged by some of the openness to spiritual experience that Bill and Tom were into, that got damaged on the back end of it. And what I mean by that is when they were doing the LSD stuff and other things out in California, that rolled out of control and steamrolled over a lot of young people who were seeking. And I think Tom felt a responsibility for his part in that. And he ended up, like, all these hippies started coming in the 1970s, people who are open to so many things.
Mhm.
And he was teaching them about responsibility and the rules. And it was interesting because there's a description of one of these persons. They were saying, here I am with, this suit and tie advertising executive, and I've got my Volkswagen, bug, and here we are, staring up at the starry, celestial heavens, and talking about some of the most far out stuff.
Right.
This is the kind of person that he was. Anyway,
Yeah.
did you want to jump in? I didn't
Well,
mean to.
it's not when my mind was going, it's not unlike the monastic movement, in the 3rd and 4th century. It's like, all right, it's getting kind of corrupted over here. We're gonna come over here and try to do it differently, more intentionally.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, so in the very beginning, this farmland that he bought, it was, something of a drying out place, meaning people would
Mm-hmm.
come. And then what had happened is the people that were there they'd go to the local Catholic church, they'd go to the local Episcopal church. They were very involved and Tom was involved in this hybrid version of supplementing your program with religious help.
Exactly. So that's what I want to focus on. So that worship, some sort of worship, is a part of the practice.
Yes.
That can be helpful. That's missing in 12-step. It can't give it.
Yes.
It shouldn't give it.
Yeah.
And yet going to find that is or can be helpful. It's difficult to find too. I got to put that out there,
Yeah, it really
few and
is.
far between, but if you can find it, man, hang on to it.
I think he saw that was so critical and so important that when he was afraid of its corruption, they kind of brought it,
Brought it back.
they brought it back in-house.
Yeah, and kind of did their own. You did your own.
Exactly. And
had a chapel, had a sacred, so you created sacred space.
Yes.
And that's an important element that the religious traditions can offer: sacred space. Music. I was struck when I visited you. We did a 12-step meeting on a Saturday night, which was preceded by maybe a half hour, 40 minutes of music. And music was an important element to this transformation of consciousness. Would you say that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think from the earliest days, as part of the practice built into East Ridge was psalmody. Everybody would get together and sing psalms. They had an Anglican form of chant that they would do, but that was something that everyone did.
Yeah, but you also did drinking songs.
So when we would do the the Saturday sing meeting, which is, I've never seen anybody replicate this. Have a 12-step meeting where you actually get together and sing.
Right.
And it goes back to, AA. If you were to go over to Bill Wilson's home, he'd be playing the cello and people be playing the piano and they'd be singing. I mean, I think that our times have changed. I think people did a lot more of that back at that time. Anyway, it was a major part because, singing is oh God, every time my prayer time goes dry, I start singing hymns, and all of a sudden I get a total shot in the arm.
That's right. Or listen to some Leonard Cohen or things of that nature. That, I mean, poets and musicians who touch the soul.
Yeah.
This is important.
Well, I think one of the things about singing that's is of interest is we talked very much about ego deflation and about having associations or interpretations with words and so forth. That you hear the word God, you already know what you think that is.
Right.
When you sing, for some reason, it's able to bypass a lot
Yeah.
of that logic chopping kind of thinking.
It's
And
left. It's leaving your left brain and transitioning over to your right brain. And that's where it happens. That's where it happens.
Yeah, I feel like it's very much a thing that can bypass logical
ego.
thought, just and touch the heart.
The ego.
Yeah, and touch the heart in a way that
that's it.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. So those kinds of practices were very important to Tom. He saw they were very important. He always had I think since he got sober and really started to make his movement towards Christianity, his marriage had fallen apart in the early beginning of his recovery. I would say it was like 1951. I think he had always had something of an inclination towards the priesthood. And even Sam Shoemaker was very involved in that and was trying to help him discern. And in a way, he kind of came back around to that, if you will, in a very unusual way. Like, I don't know how to tell people how to relate to this to someone else that's in the program, but he felt a certain kind of calling, and he started to relate to God in a group form with certain devotions and disciplines, and it was interesting in the sense that it was you can't do an end run around the fact that when a group forms and it gets a name and things like that, it becomes something of its own little sect. Yet right. At the same time, there were I remember hearing the story of one of the early guys who came in. He was a non-practicing Jew, and he came in right away, and he was all hot on his recovery and all excited, and he said, "I want to become a Christian." And I just remember that what Tom ended up telling him is, learn how to be a good Jew first. Like he had this way of not, he wasn't trying to win points for a particular team. He was really trying to tell each person to seek God as you understand him, take that very, very, very life-alteringly serious. And where are these discrepancies or differences, we need not, beat each other up or kill each other over them or alienate.
That's a good place
another.
To start. Stop killing.
Yes. And there is a long history of that in religion.
There is. You can't avoid it. You can't avoid the truth of that. So there are many, many things that are going to scare one away from religious practice, exploration. I understand. To me, it's the mystics who have always been out on the edge and who can see something beyond the mechanical, the machine part that religions get themselves trapped in. They're always touching, like you said, the experience of God. And if you've got a Muslim and a Hindu and a Buddhist and a Christian who have had that experience, it's very, very similar.
Yeah.
And it's ego deflation at depth, and getting in touch with something that is beyond the self, and that's what gives meaning and purpose to life. Now, how do you live that out? How do you express that? How do you organize it? Well, poorly, but if you can see through it and see what's going on at the essence of it.
Yeah.
And I think you're touching something.
Yeah, well, I've always been fascinated. I mean, this is a problem in the sense that it's very difficult to talk about these things in this way in a regular 12-step meeting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
If you were to bring in your political views or, it's a very difficult thing. And yet, when you go back and look at the people who put this thing together, they had a very uh, disciplined approach to God that involved devotion and work and
Right.
study and all kinds
Right.
of sources. They got into all kinds of stuff. I mean, everything from paranormal things to, whatever. They got into a lot,
Mm,
but they were sincere in their approach to seek God. They knew that God was the answer. And they had themselves their own practice. Now, except for rare occasions like Bill Wilson mentioning the St. Francis prayer, or, you know, no, they did, smuggle it in where they could, having the 1955 convention in St. Louis, where
right.
they were going to reach a lot of Catholics and things. I mean, they did certain things, but they were very careful to be cautious at a group level,
Yeah.
because people are relating to God wherever they're at, and there's room for growth. But in their own personal lives, these guys were into everything under the sun in a very sincere and authentic way.
Right.
And I feel like that anybody in the program that is also seeking in the same way is going to benefit. And if they just go with the idea, okay, we don't talk about these things in meetings, therefore it doesn't include, there isn't a place in my life for it, then I
That's
think
it.
they're going to do themselves a terrible disservice, in my view.
Yeah, my view too. And that, Matt, is why I wanted to have you kind of bring this series home, because I think I know you get that. And that's the message I want to communicate to people. I'm not out to make people Christians or anything like that. It's the
Yeah.
furthest thing from my mind.
Yeah.
But there are things out there that are elements of religious faith traditions that can be very helpful. Let's identify what they are, and ask God in your morning prayer, can you lead me to some of these? And
Yeah.
what can that look like for me?
Well,
Um,
I would
Go
say,
ahead.
like, possibly in closing, but I would say one of the things for anyone that's listening, that's like, how do I relate to this whole thing? Because it seems like a jungle. I mean, the whole thing of, like,
Yeah, that's right.
there's different churches, and there's these problems, and there's, all kinds of, it just looks like an absolute mess. And you're like, okay, if I want more, or I'm supposed to get more, what do I do, and how does that look? I would say the primary thing that a person does is start off with the four absolutes. The four absolutes are an actual attribute. They are the attributes of God. That's synonymous all over the world from the beginning of time. Everybody has understood God to be truth and love and unselfishness and purity. Everybody has always seen God in that way. It doesn't matter, whether it's Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim or anything. And if you start to get serious and to work with them practically in your life and in your actions, and to review yourself with them and to pray for help to practice them, you will start to get more direction. You will find other people who are taking them serious, and you may then bridge the very difficult gap over into devotion with others and faith with others. If you don't have those absolutes as kind of a foundation, you may not find it. And also, if you do, you'll probably end up taking it in a very superficial way anyway. Start with the absolutes, is my view.
I think that's excellent advice. They are universal, and if they're practiced, they are going to bring about radical transformation, which is what this thing is about. So listen, we could go on for hours. I know that, and we need to. We're going to do some more series uh, sometime down the line, and I really look forward to that. Matt, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and your experience. It's been tremendously helpful, and I miss seeing you, man. It's
Yeah, same here.
so it's good to get together. And I want to thank you guys for listening. I hope you made some sense of this, and I will put a link to that earlier series that we did on Tom Powers and some of that material. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I'll also put a link to the book, Invitation to a Great Experiment, which was Tom Powers' book, where he tries to record some of these thoughts in a very helpful way. It's a powerful and transformative book. So thank you all for listening. Hope it helped. And I hope you'll pick up a practice or two and see where it takes you. So thank you for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.